All right, welcome everyone. We are excited that you have all chosen to join us today for the MLS Clear Cooperation Proposal, MLS Statement 8.0. Want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and we will have it posted to the CMLS website by Friday, tomorrow, November 1st. And you are welcome to share it and review it again. We encourage that. We absolutely appreciate you investing your time with us today to educate yourselves, your organizations, your staff, and really help shape the future of our industry. As the National Trade Association for MLSs, the CMLS Board of Directors supports this policy and wants to ensure that cooperation remains the bedrock of our industry. We firmly believe that that's what makes us both pro-competitive and pro-consumer. And so we're really excited about the opportunity to engage you, our membership, on this topic, gathering the best and the brightest in the industry to brainstorm, debate, and discuss the purpose of this policy, what will implementation potentially look like if it's passed, and really think about the long-term impacts for all stakeholders. So please join the conversation, share your insights, opinions, and questions. This is our collective MLS moment that definitely will help shape our future. So with that, I would like to get into the good stuff. If I can advance the slides appropriately. There we go. Whoop. All right. So today, you do hear me make that statement fairly commonly about having everyone help shape the future of our industry. And, you know, this topic, this call is doing exactly that. We are working collaboratively to share our experience and our knowledge and our ideas to make the industry better for both our stakeholders, all stakeholders within the industry, and then also ultimately better for the consumer. We had our highest number of people register for a webinar with this particular topic, so I think that's great that people are engaging and want to talk about it. We are going to do some question and answers. We did ask for that from everyone before. We worked with NAR to get a lot of what's being asked of them. And so as we're going through this, just know we've definitely considered that as part of our questions with the panelists. And then please use, there is a Q&A box on the Zoom meeting. So if you can use that versus the chat box, and that way everyone can see it and we can correspond with you there. And Betsy Hansen from CMLS will be monitoring those and chime in when appropriate. And then we'll definitely try and leave some extra time at the end for all of those. And with that, I would like to have our panelists introduce themselves. If they could tell us a little bit about them, their organizations, and sort of their perspective or experience with this policy, and also so you can get familiar with their voices. And I'm not sure that I introduced myself, but just to make sure, Danae Evans, the CEO of CMLS, and thank you very much for joining us. So with that, Sam, will you start our introductions?
Sure, thanks, Danae, and thank you to CMLS for having us here today. I'm Sam DeBoard. I am CEO of Real Estate Standards Organizations. We work with you for data standards to move the industry forward in its technology for professionals and consumers. I want to be clear that today I'm not here to talk on RESO's position. This is not Sam DeBoard's opinions. I serve as liaison this year for NAR, liaison for MLS and data management, and I've served on the MLS Technology and Emerging Issues Advisory Board for a number of years. So my position here today is really to just relay to you some of the facts of how we got here, how the policy proposal came to be, and answer questions about how the policy proposal might work in any of your marketplaces if the industry decides that this is the right answer and this is the policy we want to move forward with.
Thank you, Sam. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Elson, the CEO of Smart MLS in Connecticut. And after about a year or so of research and diving into things, seeing what the issues were and possible solutions, we implemented a similar type solution back in April of this year. So here to share our insights, our ups and downs, and where we are today.
Awesome. James. Or I call you Jim, so Jim James, you tell us which one you prefer today.
Sounds good. This is Jim Yockel. I'm the CEO of the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors and our broker-owned MLS, and also a part of the New York State Alliance of MLSs, which represents about 10,000 members across a pretty good chunk of western central New York State. We took a slightly different approach. Like many of you, we've been dealing with this issue in our marketplace for a while, and about a year and a half ago, we launched a pretty simple form to put some structure to how people could take advantage of putting a listing in the MLS, but allow for delayed showing or delayed negotiation on a property so it can be marketed or prepared. So I'd be happy to talk about our experience with that.
Great. And I would ask all my panelists, I did get a couple of pings while you were each talking to make sure that you're close to your mic so that we can all hear you really well. Okay, so I think a good place to start is going to be with Sam, and I will be putting up here the current policy. I can outsmart my technology. Sam, how did this policy come to be? Why are we addressing it now? And what was the purpose? What's the intent of this from the beginning?
Sure. So we've gotten requests at NAR's MLS advisory board for a number of years, and these have come from brokers, from agents, from MLSs, looking for more guidance on off MLS listings, more ways that potentially they could have policy that would help them ensure better cooperation and better consumer and professional marketplaces. And as an MLS advisory board, we always look at the local flexibility, local control as a really important part of MLS, and look for situations where maybe only a national policy is going to be the answer. And those are usually the only places where we would weigh in. We really do try to keep as much of an eye on local flexibility as possible. But as these requests got louder and more frequent over time, this advisory board, which is made up of about a dozen brokers and a dozen MLS executives, a couple of which are direct representatives of CMLS, the group decided it was important to give the industry a choice, to say, this is what's been asked for by a number of different organizations. So let's put a policy proposal together that will solve some of these issues potentially for the industry, and then let the industry decide if this is really what's right to solve those issues that folks are looking for a better cooperative marketplace. So that policy was worked on for months within this group. It came out 6 weeks prior to the MLS committee meeting that will happen in San Francisco, with the intent of making sure everyone could ask their questions, could get their concerns out. Clearly, there's some complexity across different marketplaces. And so we wanted to make sure within that 6 weeks, also today during this session here, as well as over the next week, that you can all ask your questions, we can get those concerns out, and at least make sure we've answered all of the questions about the policy so that decisions can be made based on those informed conversations when we get to San Francisco next week. And that conversation with the MLS committee, and if proposed and moved forward to the board of directors, can be made by an informed group of folks that you all have the ability to discuss with in the meantime. So that's really our hope, is to give you that choice to answer all the questions that may potentially come up in the meantime, so that we make a decision based on everyone understanding exactly how this policy may work.
Great. And I think one of the big parts of this, Sam, I think one of our big goals is just for clarification so that people do understand the true intent and what the words in this mean or how it might play out. So definitely a goal of this call today, and CMLS's goal to engage everyone. And you pointed out that CMLS has appointees, and I would like to just follow up on that to just state that as part of the NAR CMLS partnership that we entered into a few years back, one of them was that we do have 3 CMLS appointees to that Emerging Issues Technology and Emerging Issues Advisory Board. I think I have it correct finally. So we have 3 people in there, and just know that there is MLS there is an MLS perspective at that table helping to shape these and using the MLS knowledge and experience to do that. The other place I just want to echo, Sam, is that this did come out 6 weeks prior to NAR, and I will say that when I first came on, the conversation was very different about how policy was done, and that it came out much closer. So I really think that we should all take a minute to celebrate that we've got some time to talk about it and work through this clarification. So with that, I also wanted to point out we're going to go over some resources today, and I've got this next slide here that we will talk about. They're terrible long links, and we will post this so it will make much more sense when it's on the website and you can just click on it, but I'll go ahead and put those up there if you guys want any of these. But these are some of the resources from our members or from our panelists today. And then we also do have some of the resources from NAR, which also takes me to the next piece, that they're not official panelists, but I'm going to call them our phone a friend options, or like in football when they throw the red flag and they call in the experts in New York to say, hey, what do we think is the actual on this? We do have both Rodney Gancho and Renee Galicia from NAR on the phone with us in case there is a policy question that we're not quite sure of, that we can get them to help us answer that question. So I wanted to have that. Everyone knows they're on the call. And so next I'm going to go ahead and ask Jim. We just talked about confusion and some clarification on what is happening. And I do read a lot of stuff that I don't think it's not being communicated or translated correctly. So one of the main things is, don't get between me and my client. The MLS can't tell me how to serve my client, can't prevent me from what is doing in the best interest of the client. So how are you, I think you've been hearing that, we talked a little bit about it, but how are you responding to that? And what do you think is really the key part of that, and putting it under the purpose and intent of this policy?
Yeah, I would just echo before I start, the benefits of having a 6-week lead into this has been fantastic for us. Knowing that this is coming and giving us a chance to engage with our brokers and our agent members and our board has been super helpful. And when we first heard about this, we reached out to all of our major brokers. I had a long discussion at our board of directors meeting. And I guess the most common reason to oppose this policy is the thought that, why should NAR have the authority to dictate to me as a broker or me as an agent how I can or cannot consult with a consumer and decide what's best for them to sell their home? And that's a legitimate question to ask and worth exploring. And we did. We spoke to a couple of different brokers about that topic. And I think where I came down is, if we can put some structure to some of the craziness that's happening in the marketplace while still respecting that desire and need for a broker agent to differentiate themselves as needed, as appropriate, based on their conversations with our client, I think then we're off to a good start. The problems come when policy changes are viewed as dictates from people who don't have these kind of conversations with their members. So in my conversations locally, regionally, nationally, I think we've come down to the point of let's have some conversation around the structure of how we can control the worst parts of this, and then give people options on how they might be able to work within that policy to best work with their consumers as the conversation dictates.
Great. Kathy, about 6 months ago, you implemented a new policy similar to this one. What has been your biggest challenge to making this change? What's your biggest successes, or what positive outcomes have you seen?
So our board spent about the greater part of a year reviewing all policies and created a comprehensive policy to handle this issue in the Connecticut market. Our biggest challenge was educating and all the misinformation that was out there. So the game of telephone was rampant as to what things were and what things were not, which led us to what's on the screen now is our chart. So in essence, we were putting policy around what people were doing in practice, and letting people, the game of telephone started, people started using the system and doing delayed entry listings and coming soon listings, and one person had success with it, and then another person saw it, and it worked for them, and another person saw it, and it worked for them. And they forgot about the cooperation piece, that sharing of the listings, and when their buyer goes to look for a property, they can't find that property on the MLS. So whenever we talk to our members, their greatest obstacle with the MLS was that they'd go to the system and nothing was there, and they'd look silly in front of their consumer, and then they'd search and try to find out what other information they had. So we took that information and coupled it with the traditional listing, which is the standard MLS policy, where listings go within 48 hours of the listing agreement, which in today's environment is impractical, and consumer agents were letting themselves work for free and not covered by an agent with their listing agreement, because they weren't taking listing agreements until 48 hours prior to that listing going in the system. So we created this delayed listing form, which everybody uses instead, and allows an effective marketing date so they can be under contract but be protected by a listing agreement, but not have to put the listing in the MLS until they're ready to market the property.
Great. Sam, another common misunderstanding I'm hearing is around the time requirement. And just so everyone knows this, that what's on the screen is only part of Kathy's whole sheet. I just couldn't put the whole paper on there, but it is the link below that Kathy's been willing to share. She also has as part of her website, a link to compliance as to what happens and how she's implementing that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But Sam, another misunderstanding I'm hearing is around the time requirement for when a listing is required to be entered into the MLS. And I think some of that confusion comes because there's the 24 hours in the policy itself. So can you take a minute and just clarify those differences and what each means?
Sure. And could you bring up the policy, because there actually is one important change. The advisory board met yesterday based on feedback from brokers to talk about that timeline. And based on the requests of brokers, some of whom have practices where they need to have staff in the office to actually turn in listings for their agents based on their internal processes, we discussed and voted to adjust the 24 hours to 1 business day. So in that case, if someone needed to get a listing in and the timeline was triggered on a Saturday, but it was a 3-day weekend, they could still wait until the first business day when the office was open. So that's one thing that folks will want to take note of. That will be what actually comes to the MLS Policy Committee in San Francisco. So one thing we wanted to be clear about on timelines here is this is a different timeline than the local MLS's turn-in timeline. Most MLSs probably have a different number, whether it's 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days from when a listing is signed to when that listing must be turned into the MLS. Those still exist. Those still are the standard of practice for MLSs. The reason that this policy exists is just for the situation where the listing has been publicly marketed before it gets into the MLS. In that specific case, that triggers this timeline that clearly the property is ready to be marketed, and so it needs to be into the MLS within 1 business day. So just important we keep those two separate things. Brokers still have the opportunity in MLSs that have longer turn-in timelines to have that time to get the listing, to do the preparation they need, follow those local rules for turn-in timelines. The only difference is if the property's been marketed publicly first, now this 1 business day trigger comes into place and it needs to be turned in within that timeline.
Great. And so to clarify, you're saying that what's on the screen within 24 hours of marketing a property, the committee is recommending that it now would become within 1 business day.
Correct. That's what will be proposed to the committee. Of course, it's a discussion for the committee to have as well, but that's what the decision was made based on broker feedback to have the initial proposal to the committee say 1 business day instead of 24 hours.
Great. Thank you for the update and clarification on that. And also just that whatever requirement is to put a listing for your local markets that exist, whether it's immediately, what's the max length of time that it can, that I think I've heard, you know, there's 600 probably different ones. So that doesn't change. This is solely about, it's a separate timeline that is triggered once it is publicly marketed. So all the reasons somebody has to meet the needs of their consumer, their customer, and do it today, it's just once they start publicly marketing it, then it triggers this. That's
Correct.
okay. As simple as I can try to put that. Kathy, can you, I think your policy is really similar with some changes. So can you talk about how your policy is different from the proposed, NAR's proposed one, and what that looks like for you?
Sure. Our policy is far more similar than different, but the difference is regarding withheld listings. Listings that are withheld that truly the seller does not want the public to know about their listing. They want a quiet sale of their listing. Those listings require a separate form, and we require that form and the corresponding listing to be entered into the MLS so that the MLS is aware of 100% of the listings a broker has, but they're not actively out there on the MLS for others to see. The listing agent can see it, the listing broker can see it, and the MLS can see it, but nobody else can see it. We allow our withheld listings to be marketed as the owner and the listing agent see fit. They can shout it from the rooftop if they want to. Most don't, because that's why they withheld their listing anyhow. But if they do decide they want to have the benefits of the MLS, they have to wait 30 days from when the listing started to go on the MLS. And when they put it on the MLS, the market time begins from the date the listing agreement was signed, not the date they first put it in the MLS.
Great. I also want to call this out. We don't have anyone from MRED on the phone, but just in case you haven't seen this, MRED has put together, and I really appreciate their work on this, this document that talks about what they did, how they put it together, and then also a quick snapshot of what several other MLSs are doing. Kathy is in there, Canopy, Metro, MLS. So definitely some other options in there that you guys can reference and get information. Kathy, I wanted just to go back and say, you had the policy, but it sounds like you still have flexibility in your local market of what is meeting your needs. You've added some flexibility to it. Obviously, you implemented the policy, but you're supporting it with really understanding the needs of your market and that research you did.
Yeah, we tried to take, and the policy change, you know, when we started looking at this, we were headed in one direction, and then based on feedback, information sessions, we started doing sessions with 200-300 people in the room, and they would come in like an angry mob, you know, significantly not happy. Some people try to stop meetings, so you can't talk about this. And as we talked about it and as we presented the information, the audience took over. It was a pretty amazing sight to see. So I could then take a step back and let the audience then defend what was going on. They started arguing with each other about what should and shouldn't be on the MLS. And hey, I had a buyer for that had you only told me, you know, keeping it off. And then the angry mob left understanding what was going on and extremely supportive of what was going on. They might not have been as supportive publicly because they were afraid of what the people in the room that had these exclusive websites sent out exclusive listings because they didn't want to be taken off their email list. But literally, people put notes underneath my laptop, say, "Hey, you know, thank you for doing this." They'd come up to us and say, "You know, I wouldn't say anything publicly. The person next to me does this all the time. I don't want to be excluded, but this is what needs to happen." So watching that over a 2-month period of time was a pretty amazing feat. And it all went back to education and people understanding that, in essence, this is what's going on in the marketplace anyhow. We're just redefining it as to what conditions are today versus what conditions were when MLS policy was created decades ago.
And Danae, if I could follow up on Kathy's point really quickly, because that seems to be, I see some of this in the questions for the session, and we hear it a lot about office exclusives. Office exclusives still do exist. There's still the ability for folks to get exemptions on their listing if their client truly does still need privacy. So that's not something that's going away altogether. That's in NAR policy. It's in your local MLS policy as is. And there's still some flexibility, as Kathy explained. Some MLSs will do that 30-day off MLS if they are if they're taking an exemption. I believe Spokane has a 90-day time period in their MLS if someone takes an exemption. So there's still some flexibility there. But it points to the sort of the history that has existed in NAR policy, which is things within the Code of Ethics and things within NAR policy have always surrounded the relationship between the broker and consumer, much like federal laws and state licensing laws have. And they bring some of those flexible options like office exclusives, et cetera. But they've also brought rules about that relationship between a broker and consumer. So that's always the balance that we look at in terms of flexibility and clarity for the marketplace.
Right, and to add to that, so we added our policy because there's still a need for those quiet listings, those off-market office exclusive listings. But when we started collecting information on listings from agents, we had a person take 5 listings in the month of September last year. All 5 of them were off the MLS, right? Most people don't take an off MLS listing 5 times in their entire 30, 40-year career. So we just saw some agents using this as a technique as opposed to the exemption that it was intended to be years ago.
And I think that's where it comes back to, is just, it is about the cooperation, and I describe it as you're part of the community and you're contributing to it. And I just feel like that's really the underlying thing where we make sure it's either we're agreeing to be part of this community and part of this cooperative to best serve the consumer. And yes, there are those other areas and those examples when that is needed, but it's been starting to concern me a little bit, is that it's becoming more common business practice and not the one-off. So I think that's really what we're getting at, is just the heart of MLS, of cooperation. So I'm going to stop for just a second and ask Betsy, because I've been trying to watch the questions coming in, and say, Betsy, is there anything in here we could answer really quick with the questions that would be helpful? I do see one that talks about, does this have a carve out commercial listings? And I did clarify that with Renee. This does not cover commercial listings. So Renee, chime in if I'm wrong, but I think we can mark that one as answered. And then Betsy, do you have any other ones that you think we should address at this point?
I would just say quickly, if we could go over effective date, whether or not it will be mandatory, and what jurisdiction this would include. So if there's overlapping markets, that might be a good time to touch on those kind of.
So you said effective date. So when would the rule become effective? What was the other 2 things I was writing?
Sure. Whether or not this is a mandatory rule.
Oh.
And the jurisdiction.
And overlap. Okay. So of my panelists, is there anybody that, Sam, you're probably the best, and this might be our place to phone our friends, Rodney or Renee?
Sure. At least for the first 2 questions, this will be proposed as a mandatory policy to be effective January 1st, which is a March implementation. That's the standard for a policy coming out at an NAR annual conference. And I'll just let Renee or Rodney jump in there on the jurisdiction question or any corrections on exact date there.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
We've got you.
Okay. So for the effective date, you were spot on, Sam. The effective date of the policy is January 1. Local MLSs would have until March 1 to implement the policy. As for the jurisdiction question, multiple listing services have the ability to establish their own jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions may parallel that of the realtor associations that own and operate the MLS, but MLSs are encouraged to have natural market areas, their service area. The MLS can require that participants who take listings within their jurisdiction submit those listings to the MLS. So that's the listings we would be talking about here, would be listings that fall within the service area of the multiple listing service. If there are MLSs that have overlapping jurisdictions, then participants likely already have an obligation to submit those listings in those overlapping areas to both services. And this policy would parallel that with regards to any off MLS listing that was subsequently publicly marketed.
Can I have the group maybe talk a little bit about, I think it's in the policy language here. I want to go back to that screen. What is publicly marketed mean? I think we had one or two questions in there about yard signs trigger like print. What is that being discussed as?
I think based on what you've got there in the policy, the intent was to make it clear that these are, although there will always be some interpretation need to be done locally, communications that are sent out to a wide audience are the intent of what would be covered by public marketing. So some specific things that were listed there by the advisory board members, such as yard signs, wanted to make it clear that even though this may not be a broad internet website that a sign is advertised to, it is advertised to the public, and it does create a situation where professionals have difficulties serving consumers if they can't get access to that listing right away, or create some disjoint in the marketplace. So those specific things are there, but we can certainly try to help by answering specific other questions for folks if they have particular things they'd like to know whether it would be considered public marketing.
Okay. I think that might have covered some of those answers or some of those questions in there. Let's go next to, we've got a few of you on here who are doing, who have implemented this, but there are several MLSs that have already implemented policies like this. And it's working. How will this affect MLSs who don't already have a policy? What are they going to need to do? What are the action items to effectively meet the requirements of the policy, balanced with the business needs of the brokers? And I'll put that out to any one of the panelists who would like to.
So in my mind, it starts with education, getting groups of people together to educate them onto why, and then how to utilize form, maybe create a delayed entry form, or educate people to put information into their listing contract so that they've got a listing effective date, and then they've got this effective marketing date or delayed entry date, so that everybody's on the same page as to what can happen. And then we all know that things change, right? You know, someone's going to come and they're going to redo their bathroom, they're going to paint or whatever, and plans fall through, so that date can change. And as long as no marketing is taking place before that, that date can be whatever is mutually agreed upon between the listing agent and the seller.
Jim, you have, I have on the screen your particular form for your area. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you've been handling it, and how you would see this impacting your market?
Yeah, we took a slightly different path, but I think we started in the same place that Kathy did. The biggest issues were agents felt like having listings off the MLS, not knowing what was available, was impacting their professionalism in the eyes of the consumer. And again, we take everything back to how can we as an industry put our best foot forward to the consumer. And the other piece was, you know, if you're just putting a sign up saying this is coming soon and there is no contract, you are unprotected. And that's a challenge that a lot of people weren't really aware of. They saw someone else do it, so they tried to do it, but didn't think through all the consequences. So as we had those conversations, we talked about adding a status, doing some different things, But I saw in a couple of the questions, what is the time frame for an MLS provider to do that? It can be long, and it can be expensive, and it can be a lot of effort. So we decided that's not what we need. We need to just put some structure around it so that the legitimate cases where we want delayed showings or delayed negotiations can accomplish that for the seller without making the rest of the profession look bad. So we came up with this form. It's pretty simple, and all we're trying to do is say there's no incentive for you to not put in the MLS anymore. If it's a matter of, you need to do some prep work, or you want to get some professional photos or a virtual tour or a drone footage, go ahead and do it, but sign a contract, put in the MLS, delay showings or delay negotiation for a while until you can market it properly, generate the interest you need, and then on this date, everybody has access. And it's not perfect. It's solved a lot of problems. There's always some challenges, but it's something that everybody can count on, and it's done a nice job of cleaning up a lot of the confusion in our area and helping the agents serve the public better.
And on that, I think I'll switch. We will get all these links in there, and I saw someone ask if we could put them in the comments box, and so Betsy, I don't know if you were able to do that, but the other thing we included in here was this link right here, and you can just Google these too, but the NAR FAQs were just updated, I believe, as of yesterday, Sam, or today, just very recently, based on all the comments and feedback that you guys have been getting.
Yes.
And I double checked that it is updated. So anybody who had the original, there's more, right?
There is, and this is easily shareable now. It's got more sort of an extended FAQ with more questions that we've gotten from the industry and answers there. So, and to follow up on Jim's point, there's some confusion about whether this is a coming soon policy. It's not. It's about off MLS listings, but clearly there's some overlap there. And this policy doesn't forbid coming soon. It doesn't require coming soon. But it's also great to have resources like Kathy and Jim here to talk about what you decide to do in your local marketplace to pair with this kind of a policy if it does move forward. And to the question we had from an attendee, there are processes for instituting coming soon policies that may take a lot of time and effort, and there are others that Kathy and Jim have given that allow more simple ways to allow your brokers that flexibility to be able to prepare properties, et cetera, and still not be overburdensome on the MLS. So again, there's quite a bit of flexibility there, and you've got a lot of different markets in these resources to see how different MLSs are engaging with these kind of tactics.
Great. And really quick, because we did have a couple of questions about this, one of the other conversations I'm hearing or getting feedback is saying that this is anti-competitive or anti-consumer. And so I'm thinking that this has had some legal review or discussion in advance of it. So I don't know, Sam, you might be the best one to answer that question.
Sure. So we've had legal counsel involved in every one of the meetings, all of the policy development, and it has been the position of NAR's legal counsel that is clearly aware of the legal environment in the industry right now, that the policy is pro-consumer, it's pro-competitive, because the MLS has been shown many times over time to be pro-consumer, to enhance home ownership opportunities, fair housing opportunities, et cetera, that there's not that concern. There are certainly many opinions out in the marketplace, and that's okay. But for the process, for the facts of how the process have come together, that has been vetted by NAR's legal counsel through the entire process.
And from the Connecticut standpoint at Smart MLS, we had this vetted through a number of different antitrust attorneys and up the ladder as far as we could go. But the reason why we started this whole thing was because we were getting consumer complaints. They literally wanted to find out where the underground market was to find out the real hot listings that were out there. So all of our research has indicated that this is pro-consumer.
The underground market, I don't like that. Okay, so then if I could take a minute, the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about is possibly what compliance would look like on this. And Kathy, I think you've got some good stuff there, and then also Jim. But if we could stop a second, because I think there was some policy questions specifically coming in there. And so I wanted to see if Rodney or Renee would be willing to take a couple of those, or some they had some clarification or answers to, and take a couple minutes for that. But you'll have to come off mute first.
Sure, and I think we had started to respond to a couple of them via the chat, but yeah, happy to take some verbally as well.
Maybe grab the top one or two that you think are easily answered, and will help clarify some stuff.
Sure, I think, and you already touched on it, but the ones that I just answered, one related to delayed showings. Again, to reiterate, the policy doesn't seek to reach delayed showing statuses or coming soon statuses. Those are still something that the local MLSs can handle by local rule if they desire to. Certainly, the policy doesn't require an MLS to institute a coming soon status, but we're aware of various MLSs that have, for example, the delayed status. Essentially, it's a showing instruction, right? The policy doesn't reach those, so the MLSs can still handle those accordingly. And to tie into that, there was a question about, had there been some consideration for the MLS platform vendors and their ability to respond to accommodate this policy? And I think that ties into those particular statuses. Again, this policy is simply about inputting and exposing that listing to other participants within the existing platform, consistent with the requirement to already submit the listing to the MLS. So this wouldn't necessarily change anything from a platform perspective or workflow perspective that I can envision, unless the MLS wanted to institute, one of the other statuses.
A phrase that we used here all the time in Connecticut when rolling it out was, if the listing agent was going to shout it from the rooftop, we also wanted it to be shouted to the rooftop of the professional. So the professional had it in their toolbox to use if the public had it as well.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
All right.
There's also a couple questions, I think, just that I want to touch on briefly regarding IDX. And I think we clarified in our latest FAQs where the references to inclusion within IDX was intended to touch on where a seller has directed the agent not to disseminate through IDX. So you could still have a scenario where you input a listing into the MLS platform, but kind of the closed broker to broker network, if you will, but the seller has provided some instruction to exclude from display on the internet. So that's what that reference in our FAQs was getting at there.
And then this is Rodney. I'll take one of these too. There's a question that there are MLSs such as Bright and others who have adopted similar policies. So why have an NAR policy at all? And the simple answer to that is to create a national standard that all MLSs have and all participants can rely on. In addition to that, I think there was someone asked for clarification on my comment about jurisdiction before. You would only be required to submit the listing to the MLS that you were a participant or a subscriber to. If you were not and there were overlapping jurisdictions, then you would have no obligation to submit listings to an MLS that you did not participate or subscribe to, even though that jurisdiction may overlap where the listing actually is located.
Great.
Can
I appreciate you guys answering this. Yes, please do.
To the comment about why have a national policy, I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of multi-market brokers, and we hear all the time about how difficult it is to operate in multiple MLSs where rules are different. And even if this isn't a perfect policy, it creates a much better starting point for anybody to understand how they can then customize their systems and processes across a much broader market area. And I think that's a good thing. We tend to be hesitant to evolve or to move forward in this industry, and I think that's unfortunate. Any step forward and that creates clarity should be good for the participant, even if it's not exactly what they would have wanted if they were making the policy.
And Jim, that's an excellent point. I know with the IDX policies, while there were a lot of options and choices in there for local MLSs to craft their own IDX rules and regulations, the criticisms we heard from some brokers is that there were different rules and sets with regard to one market to another. So having a standard across multiple markets is a real benefit to vendors and the brokers alike.
And this is Danae. I'll add to that I do hear that consistently. It's, real estate is local, and there is a lot that goes on in your local markets that you meet those needs and you understand that. But there is also, this changing in our industry where the consumer doesn't particularly care about that as much. So it's artificial boundaries. So how do we balance that of meeting that local need, but also understanding that having more consistency across how we do things as the MLS community is beneficial, but it does have to be balanced by those local needs. So it's a very tricky place to be, but I think that with continued conversations and discussions about how we do that, we can just continue to get better and better at it. So with that, I think we've gotten quite a few of those questions on there. I'm very happy about that. So what if we spent the last little bit here, and then we can go in some of those other questions that were a little bit, maybe didn't fall under those umbrellas. We'll cover those, but let's talk a little bit about the compliance and implementation. I definitely heard that as part of the concerns, or, how would this play out and what would it look like? What needs to happen? Anywhere from, do vendors have to make changes? Is it just forms? Like, what does that look like? And so on the screen, obviously the link to the FAQs, but then also this has a whole bunch of resources. I was digging through it last night about the second bullet point on different property statuses and what you can do and ideas. And then I would also reference the MRED white paper that I got this picture here. It's on the thing is on my desk, but you can also download it. Lots of references and ideas, and there's some data and some research in there that can really help you better understand how it can impact your market. So if I could have for my panelists, maybe each of you kind of go through and see what, Kathy, what has actually been your experience? I know you've got the website, and how is this playing out for you? And then hear from Jim and Sam as well.
So looking back 5 months, the process and the compliance is self-policing. The agents give us the information, but the amount, we've cleaned up so much of the issue just by educating people, letting them know what the different options are, because we have those 4 different options. The vast majority of listings fit into one of those 4 options. We do get a fair number of calls to say, hey, I got this situation, which box should it go in? On the rare occasion, there's a box, we got to tweak things a little bit. But the difference is night and day in the last 5 months. Listings that now, and we had a coming soon status before, but it really wasn't enforced. People would put it on, but they'd also have signs and they wouldn't put them on. Now when we go and someone sends us a listing, 9 times out of 10, if it's coming soon or being pre-marketed, it's in the MLS is coming soon and it's got a corresponding listing number to it. It's definitely on the rare occasion now where listings are being marketed and not in the MLS. So I've seen significant improvement with a lot of effort educating, but not a ton of effort compliance, because our staff doesn't go out searching for the information. Members bring it to us, and when they bring it to us, usually the people are abiding by the rules properly.
Great. Sam or Jim, anything to add on the compliance piece of things?
Yeah, I can add a couple of thoughts. the general approach we take with anything like this is an educational process. When we start rolling this out, we make it as accepting to the members as possible. We try not to, imply that they're being unethical by doing what they're doing. We talk about the new policy. Here's the reason it's beneficial. Here's how you can comply. Here's the things that might get you in trouble. And it ends up being very much a hand-holding. Our experience is most people who we end up talking to aren't aware of what they're doing or why it maybe isn't the best approach. As Kathy said, most of this comes from reports from other agents that are frustrated with not being able to see a listing, or they look bad in front of one of their clients. And so we just call the agent and we talk them through it, and we try and make it as easy to get through the initial, okay, you're doing this wrong, here's how you can do it better, we're here to help. And if they don't do it wrong again, they're fine. And that's been our experience. So we try and keep things simple, just a simple form, do some education, explain, get the brokers involved first, get them to be advocates for it. And, it takes some time, but it permeates through the market, and then things just get a little bit better.
In the Seattle market with Northwest MLS, there's been a slightly different but somewhat similar rule since, I believe, 2013 or 2014. And it's basically no pre-marketing rule that ensures participants are putting their listings in the MLS. And Northwest MLS is a broker-owned MLS. So this is a policy that was generated by the brokers on the board of that MLS because they wanted this to have the same sort of effect on cooperation in the marketplace. So it was certainly an adjustment at the beginning for agents and brokers to get used to the new policy. Compliance-wise, the system, I believe, is probably similar to a lot of markets. That was a escalating set of warnings and then fines. And agents learned the process, brokers learned the process. And today it's almost just a non-issue. Folks don't really even talk about it anymore. But it was broker influenced, which I think was really helpful to the agents in understanding why that policy came to be. And I know one of the questions we got from our attendees here was, did NAR reach out to brokerages to get feedback? And one of the first groups that NAR went to was the Real Estate Services Group, which is a group of the largest brokers in the country to get feedback. Obviously, not every brokerage is going to take a public position on an MLS policy, but we've certainly gotten statements in a positive way from the Realty Alliance. I believe it was Home Services as well. So there's never going to be unanimity across the broker space, but there's been lots of feedback, lots of conversations, and some positive statements, and we'll continue to take those in over the next week.
And can I just add, when we rolled this out, I think Kathy said it before, where people were sliding notes under her keyboard, the general response from our membership was thank you. Thank you for helping us clear up some of this frustrating behavior. You had a few people who were upset, but we worked with them closely. But the general response was, we really appreciate you working on our behalf.
I think kind of following on that, like a key piece with Kathy, when you were talking about this thing, that was sort of giving the industry a black eye, because we have all of our professionals out there, and when they don't have the information, because that core of cooperation is not happening, that really does, it's a black eye on the industry. It makes us not look as the professionals. So I think really pushing back that message that it is the core of cooperation is very important for us to consider, and how this policy helps us accomplish that. And I think another piece in talking with people is, it may not be absolutely perfect, but is it a really good first step, and that we continue to tweak it and address it so that it does meet the needs, and the market continually changes. So we just, as an industry, need to be on top of that and continue to have these conversations about how we do that. How do we meet the needs of the market, both our own customers, of the brokers and the agents, and then also their customers, the consumer. So with that, I think I have a few more policy questions. One around 1.3. Betsy, can you make sure and pose those so that I didn't scroll through them all?
Sure. I think pretty much the majority of the questions that we do have left, how this new policy would impact Rule 1.3 and how that they would work together or not.
So I can answer that. And I'll also point out that the NAR MLS committee agenda is posted to nar.realtor. So anyone who wants to look at that, including the background information, all of the comments that we've received to date, can access that information. And it also touches on 1.3. The 1.3 policy is still in effect. So listing brokers who are working with sellers who have a desire, a need to keep the sale of their property more on a down low, quiet status, have an ability to take an office exclusive listing that's typically in situations where there's some sensitive issue taking place where the seller doesn't want it widely known that there's property for sale, an illness in family, a divorce, maybe it's a celebrity client. They can still use Section 1.3 to exclude that listing from distribution to other MLS participants. So how does that work in conjunction with the new proposal? Well, if that property at some point begins to be marketed to the public, that's where the new 8.0 would kick in. And that listing then, because it is already being marketed outside of the listing firm, would be distributed to other MLS participants in the service.
Great. And Rodney,
Excellent.
talk quickly about VOW and how that would work.
So VOW, as an example within the policy itself, is seen as a publicly marketed aspect. It's distributed through the internet. Because of that, just like with IDX, that would trigger this policy and the requirement of a participant to cooperate with other participants in the multiple listing service and to share that information through the multiple listing service.
So a
Can I
seller
add a quick
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a little bit more information on that one as well, because I know it sounds confusing because if a listing is on a VOW website, you'd imagine it's already in the MLS. So this is a very specific minor issue, but the question is just simply, if someone had a VOW website and they were adding additional listings to a VOW website, just to clarify if there were questions there that were being publicly marketed, those would also need to be submitted to the MLS. So I'm not even sure if that scenario is clear, and I'd love to repeat it again if someone needs it, but a listing in the MLS goes to VOW, but if you had a website that commingled both VOW listings and other listings that you're publicly marketing, those listings also need to go to the MLS. So it just backs into the same simple rule that if listings are being publicly marketed on a website, they need to be submitted to the MLS for cooperation under this policy proposal.
Betsy, I think you were about to ask another one.
Yes, Rodney, I think you'd indicated you'd like to answer the question regarding vendor firms, software vendors.
If I did, I didn't know I did. What was the question with regard to vendor firms?
Sorry, let me find it.
Has anyone considered whether MLS software providers will be able to handle the changes within the required time frame?
And I thought I think we answered that one live because Renee had touched on it. This really isn't about vendor firms. It's about a work model, right, and a process that brokers who are taking office exclusive listings or are using different solutions provided by the local MLS, whether that's coming soon or delayed showings or private listing networks, that they should be informed and educated on this new requirement, and that once they begin to publicly market those listings, that they would need to, of course, share that information with participants for cooperation in the service. Hopefully that answers that.
All right, and then that does take us to our time for today. So I was going to ask each of my panelists if we could run through and any last thoughts, suggestions, statements to this topic overall. Jim, you want to kick us off? Close us out?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, you know, in our industry, we're pretty good at putting off or finding excuses for ways to keep moving forward. And I think this is an important one where we look at the benefits rather than instantly focus on potential negative aspects. I think it goes back to giving everybody in the industry a good, solid starting point that is easy to understand. And then whether you're an MLS or a participant, you can work from there to customize it to your local marketplace or your customer base. But having a common starting point is really, really helpful.
Kathy?
So I would agree with Jim that having a starting point is extremely helpful, especially since so many brokerages cross so many different MLS boundaries. But to just take in the comments, take in all the rhetoric that's going on, and take a deep breath. Have the conversations, have the individual conversations. Get over the hump of, you know, this is bad and the quick reaction to things. Let things settle out, and it works. And look at it from an industry perspective, and that the consumer, we're getting a black eye professionally because the consumers are like, you know, why do I need the professional when they can't give me the proper information? So look at the global approach to it and keep an open mind.
Sam.
So I think in closing, the advisory board wanted to give the industry a choice, an option to look at evolving policy more toward a pro-consumer model. And that's really been the history of NAR policy, whether it's rules around the code of ethics, MLS participants, et cetera, has been to try to provide more professionalism, a better marketplace, and evolve policy based on what's happening today toward better activities and relationships with consumers. So MLS participants have always abided by a wide set of rules within their relationship with consumers, and this is another choice for the industry to see whether they want to evolve that policy even further in an attempt to make it more pro-consumer.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we will get this recording posted on the website if you want to listen again, share it with anyone else. I encourage you to do that. The goal is to educate our industry and to ask the good questions, and let's really dig through this to make sure that we are evolving that policy. We are meeting the needs of both our brokers and agents as well as the consumers, and continue to foster that efficient marketplace. So I would ask that you continue to send us any questions. We have an email set up that was part of this webinar at CMLS. You can continue to send them to NAR. And then I would just ask that you continue to engage in the conversation and ask, not can we do it better, but is there a better way to do it? And I think there, in this case, we have a better way to go about just making sure that cooperation is still the heart of our industry. So thank you all very much. Please send us any feedback, comments, or additional questions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.